Hey guys, what's up? Excoundrel here, and just a few days ago, Vainglory released a hotfix where they decided to nerf Tension Bow simply because it was dominating weapon power builds and they felt that it was a little bit too strong. I do agree with them, but this has shaken up the meta quite a lot, both in terms of builds, but also in terms of the heroes that function with those builds. So, what did they do to Tension Bow first? Well, they put out a tweet and they showed exactly the changes that they made. They reduced the weapon power ratio on the burst to 100%, and they also reduced the flat burst to 40. This makes it much worse in the early game. It also means that you need more than a Sorrow Blade to make it as powerful in terms of burst than it was previously. However, they've kept the 35% armor penetration, which does allow it to scale into the late game somewhat. It also means you need more weapon power to make it as good as it was before, which I think in general is a good thing, but it is still going to be a burst-orientated item. It is still going to be good at blowing up squishies. You just have to invest a little bit more to make it work. So I decided to test 4 different 3-item builds, and we're going to test it versus Finn, who at base armor at level 12 has 100 armor, then versus Coat of Plates is 155, Atlas and Coat 215, and then Atlas and Metal Jacket at 250. So a large spread of later game armor values, and 100 is about what you'd expect a carry to have if they've invested a little bit into armor, even with just an Aegis or a Warmail. The 4 builds that I'm comparing is the old 3-item standard build of Sorrow Blade, Tension Bow, Tornado Trigger. I then decided to shake things up and go Sorrow Blade, Bonesaw, Breaking Point to test how good Breaking Point is. Then I did Sorrow Blade, Bonesaw, Tornado Trigger to test how good that particular build is. And then I decided to do Sorrow Blade, Bonesaw, Poison Shiv just to throw another build into the mix to see what it was like. Although I don't expect that build to perform better than the other 3. So we'll see how it goes in these particular tests. So, the first build that we're going to, or rather the first armor value that we're going to go up against is Finn's base armor. And this is 100 armor, and what I had Finn do is just stand there, so big thank you to Aristocratic for helping me out here, and I essentially just had Vox attack him. And you'll notice that the first one to go down is actually the Tornado Trigger Bonesaw build, so even at 100 armor, it is doing work. Well, then we need to compare it to Finn at a slightly higher base armor value with the Coat of Plates added, and then you can see how these particular builds perform. And actually, the most surprising thing to me is that the Breaking Point Bonesaw build is actually working pretty well against high armor values. The Tension Bow build still performs very well, and actually there's a very small amount between them. But honestly, in my opinion, as a 3-item build, it looks like Bonesaw over Tension Bow is the way to go, and it also brings carries like Vox back into the meta too. It is really close between all of them. I decided to cut the Poison Shiv build halfway through this experiment simply because it just wasn't going to compete with the rest of them. And you see at the very high armor values, the Breaking Point and the Tornado Trigger build do really well here. There's a little bit lagging behind for the Tension Bow build. This is super high levels of armor though, and I don't expect many games to actually end up getting this far. But Bonesaw in this situation with Breaking Point actually wins with Tornado Trigger very shortly behind. But it's about 1 or 2 basic attacks between all of them. So I decided to then move on and have a look at some 4-item builds. And again, this is important because not every weapon power carry is going to stick solely on 3 items. And 4-item builds coming into the meta mean you can scale a little bit harder. It also functions well with Tension Bow now that the scaling is down. So to make it as good as it was before, you can go for the Tension Bow build. Now do remember, we also have to factor in cost into these particular items, and Tension Bow still is one of the cheapest weapon power items in the game. So cost is important. And obviously a Tension Bow build, if you're 1 or 2 basic attacks behind the Bonesaw build, it really isn't that big of a deal. And you also remember that Bonesaw requires you to stack on the same target, whereas Tension Bow is irrespective of target. So even though we are seeing Bonesaw outperform Tension Bow in a 3-item build, you do have to remember that Bonesaw is all about focusing that one target. And if you switch targets, you'll have to build those stacks up once more, whereas Tension Bow functions across the board. So having a look at these 4-item builds, you'll notice that actually the build with the Tornado Trigger, the Tyrant's Monocle, and the Bonesaw performs best at base armor, with both Tension Bow and the Breaking Point build just ever so slightly behind. And then we're going to test it versus Coat of Plates, and you'll notice that again, the Tornado Trigger Bonesaw build outperforms slightly at Coat of Plates level. And actually things start to even up when we get towards Metal Jacket, and everything kind of is very close in terms of respective killing time. So I think you'll notice that really there isn't a huge difference between all of these builds, and I think you have to kind of assess it from the conclusions. It looks like Bonesaw is greater than Tension Bow in 3-item builds, but remember that you do have to factor in multiple things, including none of these builds were done with infusions. You have to include the fact that Tension Bow is it gives you a respective burst against squishier targets, so is better for diving the backline. It's also non-discriminatory compared to Bonesaw, where you have to attack that same target. So, in my opinion, even in 3-item builds, it looks like Tension Bow in general is still better. But Bonesaw is a build that will viably deal more DPS to a single target. It's very good at shredding the front line, for instance, and it will also help your other weapon power carries in the game perform well, because again, it is an item that shreds armor on that target as opposed to singularly for you. It also means that people like Vox are probably back in the meta again, because the sort of the builds are very comparable now, and Vox is a super mobile carry, and in a very dive heavy meta, Vox is probably still very good. So I actually think Vox probably heads back into the top 4 of weapon power carries. Kinetic, incredibly good with that kind of build too. Breaking Point is not as bad as you thought it was. Actually, if you saw how well it compared to a lot of those builds, and Breaking Point is an item that once you get those stacks up, they're going to be very, very powerful against squishy targets as well. So actually, Breaking Point probably finding its way back into the meta right now with that Tension Bow nerf, and I would recommend that you give it a shot either with Tension Bow, if you saw a Breaking Point Tension Bow, maybe Tornado Trigger, or Breaking Point Tension Bow Sorrow Blade build. Although I would recommend if you're going to go for Breaking Point with the Tension Bow build, you go for a 4-item build, because the Tornado Trigger one is important. Tension Bow is still better versus squishy targets, so if you're looking to deal the burst damage, Tension Bow really still is the only item that will do that. And Tension Bow is going to get better with the more items and infusions that you have as well. So, those are some conclusions. I think from the outset, it levels the playing field in terms of weapon power builds. Tension Bow still is good for the people like Gwen. It's still going to be very, very good on most weapon power carries. But the fact that Bonesaw is now comparable means that you have the option to bring these more sustain, kite-heavy builds. People like Vox are going to come back into the meta. And honestly, what all this has done is it's leveled the playing field in terms of items. You make your own conclusions based on this. I've told you what I think, and I'll see you soon.